everyone. My name is Adjoa De Beer, and I'm responsible for brand at USB Executive Development, the short course arm of the Stellenbosch Business School. On behalf of Ed and the Stellenbosch Business School Alumni Association, welcome to the first webinar in our 2022 Leadership Foresight Series, whereby over the course of 4 events, we will speak to the past, present, and future focus of leadership in Africa. As Kerry mentioned, we're pleased to see guests from across the continent and extend a particularly warm welcome to our clients and partners that are in the room today. So just a few words before we start, or a few housekeeping rules. Please keep your mic off unless asking a question. However, please do keep your video on if possible. We love seeing your faces. Secondly, there will be time at the end of the session for questions. However, please do type your questions in the chat box throughout the conversation. I will prompt the panel to answer. With that, I hand over to Dr. Njeri Mwagiru, Senior Futurist at the Stellenbosch Business School's Institute for Futures Research, who will be steering the conversation for today's event titled, Driving Innovation for Impactful Change. She is joined by Colin J, Browne, an expert in organizational culture, Gia Whitehead, a founding member and chairperson of the Tiva Business School, and Dr. Shamim Bodhanya, an expert in strategy, systems thinking, and design thinking. So with that, Njeri, I hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Adjoa, and warm welcome to everyone joining us for this first in our seminar series looking at topics of leadership and foresight. I feel like coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, that intense phase in 2020, 2021, there was so much focus on change and short-term change, and we were all swept up in the momentum of the chaos and the complexity of that period of lockdowns and uncertainty. And now as we're beginning to see the pandemic draw out and as we're beginning to resettle into this new normal, as the new normal continues to emerge, we're beginning to ask ourselves the questions around what changes have we achieved? What changes are we still working on? And in terms of our organizational cultures, what really did we innovate? What did this recent crisis offer us in terms of platforms for seizing new opportunities or addressing our risks in different ways? So we've put together this series to talk around the different elements that our organizations have been going through and which of those elements are pulling through for the long term and makes sense for us to pay attention to. And I'm so excited that this morning we have a wealth of expertise, not only theoretical, but practical expertise as well, from Shamim, from Colin and Gia, sharing about their own professional journeys, their own organizational contexts, some of the change initiatives they've been driving there, but also some of the lessons and learning points that they have gone through in their journeys of driving cultural and meaningful change and impactful innovation within their work environments. So this conversation today is really to talk around why is it important to think innovatively about the creation of organizational culture? And what are some of the aspects that constitute a healthy organizational culture, especially as we're beginning to pull out of this very intense phase that the pandemic brought to us, but as we continue to realize that we live in times of complexity and continued crisis. So what are those aspects that we need to embed in our organizations to have that long-term and meaningful impact? And then also some of the practices. What are some of the practices that Shamim, Colin, and Gia can share with us? And hopefully some takeaways that we can all go back to our workplaces, think on, and maybe plant some seeds to drive meaningful cultural innovation for impactful change at our organizations. So with that, let me open up the conversation, and perhaps let me start with my colleague Gia, also from the higher education sector. And Gia, share a little bit from your perspective around why you think actually it's important to innovate around organizational culture and the creation of organizational culture intentionally.
Thanks, Njeri. It's lovely to be here. I think it's never been easy to deliberately create an organizational culture, even in the times when people are all together in one office. It really requires a conscious and deliberate journey to clearly articulate the desired culture and to deliver a strategy. And I think what's really important is around purpose and values, aligned leadership, and that's obviously reinforced by the employee experience. And obviously with COVID, where so many people were catapulted into a hybrid way of working, never really to return to full-time office, flexibility has really been a key attractor and detractor, and a culture, to build that is more complex. And so we really need to build a culture that's, in a hybrid way. And so for me, what's really important to be innovative is, to look at things around how do we create that flexibility, it also adds value in that we're able to attract talent from people living overseas and still are that can work elsewhere. And how do we foster a sense of creativity and belonging for these diverse teams? And for me, a big emphasis, particularly in my space, is around capability building. As you really build expertise, and that helps build long-term sustainability. And if you're integrating knowledge in a learning organization and looking, for example, like doing skills and creating networks and providing knowledge transfer is really important. So a culture of being intentional around leadership development. And at the end of the day, the main thing is really around transparency and ownership, and with still holding to those values and a clear sense of purpose.
Thank you, Gia. I was just nodding as you were sharing some of your thoughts there around purpose, value, the importance of flexibility, and leadership that allows for hybrid models so that you can engage employees in a way that captures the talent you need and ensures the performance. So integrating and building on your knowledge capabilities within the organization as well. I wonder if on that note, I can bring in Shamim to share a little bit around, Shamim, why do you think it's important for organizations to think intentionally around the creation of their cultures? And also, how do you think organizations can create conducive spaces, speaking to some of these points that Gia raised: flexibility, a hybrid model, employee engagement, retaining talent, and building capabilities?
Thanks, Njeri. So the way I'd like to kind of position it, there's a strong overlap with what Gia said, and I'd like to offer kind of 7 perspectives. I won't go into the detail, but I think it kind of synergizes with what's been said already around culture, and I've tried to kind of simplify it, and it goes along these lines: care, community and connection, creativity, a sense of calling, clairvoyance, that brings in the foresight, the context, and cash, and I put cash right at the end. So in a sense, those kind of 7 C's as a simple, a mnemonic to kind of remember the key dimensions of organizational culture. And I think the contribution I want to make at this point is that in the context of COVID and post-COVID and why the need, some of these tend to be accentuated, highlighted. So for example, context becomes much more important: care, connection, community, all of those are the ones that become more heightened. So culture is this kind of organic, dynamic, emergent process within organizations. And that's kind of, if I can just frame it like that, and then, in the rest of the discussion, I might bring in 1 or 2 of those perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you, Shamim. So succinct, 7 C's, speaking to some of the components of a dynamic organizational culture. And I love that you bring in that dynamism: community, connection, creativity, calling, clairvoyance, and cash. And you've also talked a bit around the COVID context and how some of these C's would have gained more importance, and depending on how the context shifts and as other crises come into play in our organizational spaces, perhaps these different C's will move around on that list. But let me bring in Colin here as an expert. Colin, what do you think around some of these components of organizational culture that Shamim has shared? And especially, what do you think are some of the changes that COVID has brought about and emerging trends that you see with regards to fostering a healthy organizational culture? So if you can speak a little the components of organizational culture and how you think these may be shifting or reflecting this dynamism that Shamim has spoken to.
Thank you, Njeri. And look, I think we have to accept that what's happened over the last couple of years has been, it's had created significant changes in the way we think about this topic. The one thing that I just want to stress, I think we need to separate things like ideas such as culture and employee engagement. I mean, one is a vehicle to achieve the other. I think by and large, during the period of the pandemic, culture has stood up rather well. If we define culture as kind of the go-to positions, right, the things that people do. It used to be in the days prior to the pandemic where everybody was in the office and we never had any sense of disruption that would ever change. We had a certain amount of comfort, a certain amount of safety, etc. We just didn't see it that way because, I mean, we always talk about people who don't have a sort of a guidance and a strong cultural narrative in an organization will always focus on the 1,000 daily irritations at work. And that's just kind of what it is. Those 1,000 daily irritations made people, and those are things like, I don't know, the photocopier doesn't work. They're always tiny things, tiny things. But those are the things that create the experience that people have in the workplace, where it's partly good, it's partly bad. If we've got a real strong focus on culture, the good outweighs the bad because we remember why we're there and all of that. But if we're not focusing on that, then those are the things we see. Not enough parking, too much traffic, there's no milk on Monday. I mean, it's crazy how small this gets. So I think when it came down to we can go home and we can work from home for a while, people were fairly pleased to let go of those things without necessarily thinking about the things they might lose. Then during the period of the pandemic, we're all working remotely, and suddenly we're realizing the things that we've lost. And those things weren't tactile things. They were things like just having the psychological safety to an extent of being within view, knowing that people know what we're doing, and therefore I don't have to constantly reaffirm what I'm doing because my boss can see. That kind of stuff started to change. That I think created this dynamic where people were working longer hours, doing more work, just overstretching. There was no switch off points, no switch on points. So all the logic seemed to go out the window. Now we're talking about going back into the office. And I think these are the things now which we're going to have to deal with as leaders. So the first things are, reintegrating people back into the office in a way that the 1,000 daily irritations don't become the focal points again. We're going to have conversations that we never really had before. We're back now, and we need to talk a lot. And more than that, as leaders, we need to listen a lot, more than we ever did. We've always argued that organizations should act like their own business school. There's so much knowledge within the company. We should be making an effort to find out what we know all the time through many more town halls, focus groups, conversations, whatever it is. And those are going to become really important now. If we can get this kind of slight euphoria for people coming back into the office and suddenly realizing, hey, it's great to be around my colleagues again. That's something to build on, not to lose. The second thing is we've got to make people fall back in love with the work. Because the one thing that was always clear when they were working from the office, with all of the stuff that was going on, colleagues and connections, and so many of the things that Shamim mentioned there, all of those things disguised the fact that what we actually do for a living is Excel. Right? And I don't mean we do excellent things. I mean, we work on Microsoft Excel. That's our job. And back in the day when we were suddenly working from home, the job was stripped down to its bare components. There was no community. There was no distractions. Even the bits of office drama, which can keep us engaged, those things were gone. Now we're just sitting here every day, plugging into a spreadsheet quietly in a room on our own, maybe with the distraction of children and all sorts of things. It turns out the job's not that great. It turns out that the job was never really the entire point. The culture was the point. And so the one thing we're going to have to do is try and re-engage on that level as well, and add all of those extra things that make being here a great place to be. So there's lots of things to focus on there. They're different.
Yeah, I really like that you have emphasized that in returning back to the workplace post the lockdown period, we are not so much reinvigorating a previous culture, but we need to be focusing on these new cultures that we want to build. And how do we reintegrate into the workspace in new ways that help us not only fall in love with our work, again, hopefully we didn't lose it and we remained engaged, but how do we build this sense of community coming back from really a sense of disruption and being disconnected? And Gia, you had mentioned earlier about the importance of retaining talent and integrating our knowledge. And this speaks to me a lot around this community that Colin is sharing around. What would you say are some of the important things to pay attention to when we think around building community, and especially building communities that attract the kind of talent internationally, as you mentioned, to the organization?
Thanks, Njeri. And yeah, I think it's really important to just, step back and think about how many people, how COVID was quite severe and long lasting, and people were really impacted at a physical, emotional, financial, even spiritual level. And people came back feeling really tired and lonely and depression, anxiety, and all those other things. And so in order to bring that learning, I think firstly, we need to go back to that human-centered, to create a healthy culture first. So before you can even begin to start learning, it's around creating those elements around like transparency and openness, so to create, understand where we're at, that trust that like Colin shared, that now we've proven that we can work elsewhere and that we can, do this work and we've earned our respect. But bringing back that meaning, and so, if you're anchored in purpose and you find meaning and creating well-being and care and making people feel inclusive before we go into that learning. And I love Shamim's C's, and I had similar points, around like different innovations for learning. So firstly, it's got to come from strategic spaces, so like leaders above, and creating that corporate strategy and opportunity for learning and innovation. And then there's that financial space, that there's actually things set aside to create that it's not always the first thing that gets cut. And obviously then how managers and time, but learning is really about creating space for innovation and making people come together and moving away from the traditional ways of doing things and creating spaces also to fail. So that innovation is, space where you can embrace, small things can create like new ideas, and then to scale. And so, so what's really important for me is all those other areas are more important than the physical spaces. And something that we do is bring people together on a weekly basis to just share stories as part of learning, or bringing in speakers or hero speakers or what people have done. And so not only from learning from an academic point of view and building on your knowledge and capability, but learning in the stories and from other people as well.
Thanks, Gia. Yes, I love that you are bringing it down to brass tacks and bringing it down to some practical components that we could take back to our workplaces as well. So learning as a really key aspect of building communities. So learning together, but perhaps also asking questions together and sharing our curiosity, perhaps some of that calling that Shamim was sharing in his 7 C's. And then I really like that you've also sort of layered it within the organizational spaces as well. So we need our executives and our leadership to be engaged with learning. We need financial commitment to learning and to innovation, and to have that resource support as well. And finally, to have a culture that allows us to experiment and to play and to fail and to try out new ideas. And some practical tools that you've mentioned are storytelling and hearing from other people in the field, and having heroes or role models that we can emulate and learn from. Shamim, could I ask you to share perhaps from your experience in the work that you do, are there any other tools or methods or approaches that you would recommend in terms of building this community so broadly, but also maybe speaking specifically to using learning as a key way or avenue of building community within organizations as well? What would you say are some tools or methods, some tricks that could help us in this?
So I think, the areas where I've worked in fairly extensively is the use of interactive spaces for learning. And by that, I mean things like gamification, things like simulations, organizational simulations, some even, what we call team building, little kind of, fairly short exercises in and of themselves can be really powerful for learning. But ultimately, I think when we're saying learning, using these kinds of tools or approaches is probably, in my mind, we're doing 2 things. What we're doing is we're getting people to introspect and reflect on who they are in relation to others, whether the simulation is on a particular task or some kind of goal or whatever it might be. But it's also about sharing through either through disruption, through some kind of activity or a game or a simulation. So in the form of disruption, which disrupts me to get me to think differently, or in the sense of being able to build meaning collectively through conversation. So we all carry what we call tacit knowledge, and sometimes it's even knowledge that we don't know, that we haven't fully figured out yet. We kind of got these hunches. And it's through these kinds of tools and engagements, we're creating the scaffolding that brings that knowledge out in a kind of a shared way. So that's a way of using learning as a way for development, for organizational growth, for building community, because these kinds of activities also bring a lot of the kind of community building through learning about each other. Because we know each other in our roles. He's the finance guy and she's the IT person, and we work together, but we don't know each other as full human beings. In some cases we do, but in many cases we don't. And these kinds of tools allows you to understand the full humanity of who I'm working with. And that's what community is about. It's the human to human connection. As much as, I'm handing over to you my financial model and you're now going to act with it, or you developing the IT system for me, which is important. But ultimately, community is about human connection. And it's about the sense of care that we bring to each other.
Thanks, Shamim. Thank you for adding some light there, talking around that human to human connection and encouraging us to see our colleagues beyond our professional roles as full beings within the organization. And let me bring in, I beg your pardon, Shamim. I meant to say thank you, Shamim. And I want to bring in Colin. He's top front of my mind because in his few comments at the beginning. Yes, Kerry.
It's Kerry. Can I interrupt everybody? Sorry.
Go ahead.
I've got a question. A lot of this is around the hybrid model and, companies coming back to, working. What about those companies that aren't coming back to the office, where you've recruited new colleagues that you've never met, that you've only ever seen on a Zoom meeting or in Teams, and that have no tangible way, other than everyone getting together for a coffee, but maybe they live far away now, and there's been a promulgation of new remote organizations that start from scratch as remote. And I struggle with that really as a head of a team in terms of my own internal team culture. And I'm an introvert. So, I'm very happy to hide away, oftentimes. And in my team, I have got extroverts, and I know that they need me to be a little bit braver and stronger. And I really struggle with my internal team culture. And I also struggle with my organizational culture because, even as an introvert, I miss seeing my colleagues. I miss the coffees. I miss the very brief human connection. And at the same time, I'm very happy to, I'm completely on board in terms of a remote working environment for the sustainable future. But the challenges that I need to consider as a leader is my budget. I need to make room in my budget for team get-togethers. How do companies sort of navigate a shift in how they spend as well? Because you can no longer take for granted that you will see your team member face to face.
Thanks, Kerry. Thank you so much for that question and for enriching the conversation here. And for complexifying some of what Shamim is recommending in terms of that human to human connection. So how do you build human to human connection when you're actually online? And I wanted to bring in Colin as well, because Colin had mentioned that some of the cultural aspects of organizations and that human to human connection is not always, as ideal as we'd like to paint it out. It has those small irritations. We're dealing with the introverts versus the extroverts, Kerry. So Colin, if I could bring you in there to expand a bit on what Shamim was sharing about seeing full people. So that's the positives and the negatives, seeing the full aspects of their personalities, and how do we build these communities online, offline, and in hybrid models or in person, given that we've been disconnected and we're trying to rebuild this new culture.
Yeah, thank you. And all good points across the board, I must say. I think what we have to do is we have to decide what it is that we want to do here. We have to decide what problem we're trying to solve, because it's not quite so easy to say, anybody who says we need to go back into the office because we need to go back into the office isn't thinking it through. Anybody who says we need to be remote because we need to be remote isn't thinking it through. It's like saying to your kid, don't jump up and down on the couch, and they say why, and you go, I don't know, because I said so. It does, like, there's got to be a reason for all of these things. Now, we've got now, in the world we're in now, a number of models to choose from. And all of them are flawed. And all of them have problems and all of them have complexities, but they also each have benefits. The one thing, so to deal first of all with the person-to-person thing. So we've seen exactly the same thing. And one of the ways in which we've got around this, and we built new employee induction processes for companies, for example, the one thing that's quite common is for executives to introduce themselves to the crew. And if you're in the head office space and the executives happen to be there, they can pop in and say hello. You get to ask questions. That's all good, right? To meet the senior leaders of the organization. But it's patchy. It doesn't happen in the same way all the time. And so, because maybe they're not always there. And frankly, when the head of the chief financial officer comes in and talks to you about the financial department for 3 minutes, who cares? I already know you're in charge of finance. I know what you do. If I'm in finance, maybe I'm very interested. If I'm not, I don't care. I know why I have to follow you because you're a leader of the organization. I just don't know why I want to. And so what we did was we've kind of taken them out and we create these sort of 90-second videos where we don't mention work at all. One of them, we actually had a guy standing in a lake, a river rather, in the Midlands in waders, because he's a real fly fisherman. And we took a 90-second video of fly fishing where he's talking about up close, putting on the fly and he's talking about excellence. He's talking about commitment. He's talking about focus. He's just not talking about work. But right away, you've got a sense of, oh, here's an actual human being. He's into fly fishing. I'm into fly fishing. Point of connection. Or anything like that. So it's about showing the human face of the other person without being really intrusive. And if you do that for everybody across the executive team, everybody gets to see who they are. In terms of the actual human beings, the colleagues, the people that we work with, we actually have a methodology for that too. I won't go into it, but I mean, we have discovered that you can have a team of people who've worked together for like literally a decade. Some people have been there and they don't know the first things about each other actually. And so when they kind of introduce each other at a personal level, we create these cryptic clues where they have to guess who's being spoken about. People are like, I did not know that about you. Now that's bonkers, right? But it's absolutely the way it is. And there's no doubt whatsoever that trust, empathy, these sorts of things that enable us to kind of go, but I get you, I kind of get you. Those come about when we know each other a little bit better. We already know what each other does, what each of our colleagues does. We just don't know who they are. And so I think we need to work on that as well. And that's both in a face-to-face space and a remote space. I think just very briefly, and I'll be very brief, but on the remote issue, there are massive benefits with working remotely. It's not for everybody. There have been challenges people have experienced. There's no doubt about it. And some of the constructs we have to create around that have to change. We have to be more focused on people being lonely, psychological health of human beings who are just don't have that connection. But let's be clear, everybody's got connections. They've got friends and family and all sorts of other things. The question is, how much meaning do we need to create around the actual work itself? And how much purpose do we need to create around it? And there are two different things there, I think. So it's a complex one. We could talk about this forever, but I think there are other people who'd like to actually have a say before I go on and on and on.
Yes, thanks, Colin. But I will come back to you on that methodology that you mentioned and actually provoke you to go into it just a little bit, maybe some high-level framing of that. But I also want to pick up on something Gia mentioned that has come through in your lovely example there about the fly fishing, which is creativity. And the ways in which hybrid engagement and online work have really pushed us to be more creative in our engagements. And, what are some of the creative approaches that we have developed? Gia, perhaps you might have some examples that you wish to share with us, or maybe you want to emphasize a bit more why it's so important that we're more creative in terms of our interactions. And not only in terms of the hybrid and online connection, but as Colin mentioned, even this person-to-person connection, how do we use creativity to get to those other aspects of ourselves and get to know our colleagues in more full ways outside of their professional roles? So maybe we talk about creativity just a little bit, Gia.
Right. Yeah. So I think coming back again, it's really about like that common purpose. And I think if you find like your collective work meaningful and being more creative, so other than like ramping up communication online and sharing stories, so one example that I've used in some organizations is standing for something bigger. So working on a project that is maybe outside of your organization, you know, and whether it's like building a community or working on something where you actually, you know, find a real example that brings you together to support. So it's not only about you, and for also those introverts, it's the focus is on out there and what can we as an organization do on a project, whether it's physically on the ground or through online support that can engage us and bring us together. And I work with one organization that is fully online. For the past 2.5 years, they have never met in person. They come from all over the country. And what's worked is bringing them together for leadership type sessions or talks or engagements where they have just time to connect, and with breakaway rooms and playing, like you said, cool games online, and ways in which you can kind of bring that connection. That's fun. I think something that we miss, and that's something that people want, whether it's online or in person, is elements of fun and humor, and that brings out creativity. I've seen some cool online tech tools where you can do art, and you can all add to an art piece in an online space, or bringing in like cool speakers or comedians or whatever it is that brings that element of just going back to like this new normal without only focusing in the workplace. Yeah, so I've got lots more stories to share, but I think it's about that fun and around finding something bigger purpose other than just around what your organization is, but what else can you do out there, especially in the realities of like what's happening with climate change, and like in the floods in Durban, or whether it's, you know, to do with gender-based violence or xenophobia, all these big issues that we're all having to deal with wherever we are.
Yes, Gia, that sense of working together as a community to fill a larger purpose, I think, is very well noted. And if I can bring us then from that macro lens of community back to the self. And Shamim, you had mentioned that it's about self introspection as well as relationships to others as well. Let's take it back a little bit to the self. We speak easily about creativity and being playful and being open to failure, but not all of us are oriented this way. There's still some personal behavioral changes that some of us have to get through. And how do we as individuals go through those processes of change to connect better with our colleagues? What do you think we as full beings can do for ourselves in terms of some self-introspection? Are there any suggestions that you would give or recommendations?
Yeah, so Njeri, I think, you know, there are many ways in which we could do this. I mean, I'll just share with you some relatively simple ways that I've used working with people, and I mean, something like journaling, okay? There are many ways in which you can introduce people to journaling, and for some people, journaling is just something they don't do, and they're hard to do. But if you create a space and you create the safety, I'll give you an example. I actually ran something last week where there were probably 9 people. And we were in a physical space, but you know, I can translate it into an online space. We were in a physical space, and I'll just kind of share the setting with you. We were in a fairly big room, and people were feeling uncomfortable. And it's just about setting the boundaries and the safety for journaling to happen. And we gave them 30 minutes, and in 30 minutes, obviously with some ground rules that prevents non-journaling, if I can put it that way, which was a bit tricky for people up front. And in 30 minutes. It had a huge impact on what people were able to come out with. And the thing is, the creativity in these kinds of practices is there's myriads of ways in which you can do it. So you don't do it all the same way. You get them to think about it, to use a poem, you take them through a kind of a mindfulness process, breathing exercises, a bit of somatic work. There are many, many ways in which we can get people to start reflecting on who they are in and of themselves and in relation to others and the bigger whole and the world. And that can be done, you know, you can do it lovely if you're outdoors and, you know, those kinds of things. But even in online spaces, there's creative ways of doing it. There are many tools that's available to us and so on. So yeah, that's, I mean, journaling is one of them, but there's other ways. You can use kind of kinetic work. You can use things like Play-Doh, and you just get people, the head, hand, mind, heart integration all together at the same time. There's many ways in which you can get people to introspect, reflect, and so on. I'd like to just make one contribution, though, kind of a slightly different angle, is that we also need to be open and invitational to the diversity of people. So not everything's going to fit everyone, and not everybody's going to love the fun stuff all the time. So we need to have this kind of, not even tolerance is not the right word. It's almost an open perspective to respect people's diversities and how they do things, and then find ways to embrace them, to meet them where they are. And so you know, we also got to be flexible and adaptive. If something's not working, it doesn't work for a team, it's fine, you know. Yeah, so let me stop there for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Shamim. Flexibility, being adaptive, and again, creating those spaces is so important. And I think this is part of the organizational cultural innovation, that a culture doesn't exist in abstract. It's something that you live out in practice and experience, whether it's in an online space or a physical space. It is about that interaction amongst communities. So Colin, are you ready with your high-level framing of your method that you can maybe just share with us so that we can take the conversation a little bit further and feel maybe a bit more situated in terms of some actual steps that we could roll out if we were interested?
It's just about getting to know one another, Njeri.
Yes,
so look, very simply, we have a process that we call How Well Do You Know Your Colleagues? The idea is that everybody shares secretly with us 3 pieces of information that are very real, but you probably may not know. The colleagues may not know. We write very cryptic clues, and then everybody sits around and they have to guess who's being spoken about. It's quite interesting that some people guess themselves wrong, even in this this process. But what happens is that people have then shared a little bit about their background, something that, you know, because goodness. For many years, I was a journalist, and I would sit down and interview people, and we'd be humdrum, and then they'd say something, and I'd go, wait, what? And they go, oh, is that interesting? I didn't realize that would be interesting to you. Because we don't always think, right? My life has been going on for years. I've done lots of stuff. You ask me the highlights, I'll tell you what I think they are, but to you, there'll be something there which goes, wait a second, that's really interesting to me, which I don't really think is that special. And that's kind of how we all are. And so, what'll happen is, you know, we had a situation at Allianz Insurance where the guy who ran the department had been an amateur boxer for 10 years. It's super interesting, actually, and it tells you a great deal about commitment and focus and, you know, willingness to accept pain, whatever it is. It tells you a great deal about the guy, which you'd never have guessed. And these bits and pieces that are missing from these conversations that we have, these points of connection, I think. In every single one of us, there are things that we do and there are reasons that we do them. And if we can understand a little bit about the reasons that we do them, then we can connect a little bit better. And so that's really all it is for that. But it's not just about people, you know, it's about the organization as well. Excuse me. I don't know when the last time was that you guys played a board game for the first time, like a brand new board game. Probably been a while. But typically what happens when you start with a new board game is somebody pulls out the instruction book, and we have this long, complex reading of a set of instructions for a game nobody's ever played. And that's how we explain as organizations, that's how we explain ourselves to our people. So you're going, you know, we're all sitting there looking at this board on the table, and we're going, so wait, if I land on a green square and there's a yellow house and I've thrown what happens? The reality is, it is far better if we say, okay, fine, here's how you win the game. You must have the most money and the most hotels. Are we ready to go? Let's figure it out as we go along. Because all the way along the line, especially when it comes to something like culture, we're going to be dealing with variances. I mean, the most variable things in the entire world are human beings and human emotions and the way in which we react to things. And all of these things need to be explored. We need to give people the space to do the sense making that they require to just kind of figure this stuff out. And unfortunately, what we tend to do is we tend to put together a project plan on an Excel spreadsheet with 5 pillars and 6 things we're going to do, and then we push. And by the end of it, we've processed everybody, but nobody knows what the hell we're doing here.
So I'm hearing there that you're emphasizing first the importance of journaling so that we can become more visible to ourselves and see our stories for ourselves and perhaps realize that we're more interesting than we initially expected, and also finding spaces to share with others, and that there's some actual processes that can help us with that. It doesn't have to be, it can be open and flexible and emergent, but also very structured. And I want to focus a little bit around that. I mean, let's talk a bit about the challenges around building organizational culture and innovating organizational culture. I think we speak here from the context of COVID, where we were all disrupted and had to change because of the context. But what about those obstacles and those barriers to change? What happens when we are not able to attract the talent that we need or create the kinds of spaces that make employees feel engaged? Gia, I wanted to bring that to you and see if maybe there's anything you could share there around how do you first and foremost confront these challenges? So be quite honest around what your organizational culture looks like and what the shortcuts may be. And then what are some approaches to overcoming some barriers to change and cultural innovation that you faced?
Thanks, Njeri. Yeah, it's a tough one. I think, as I was saying earlier, I mean, COVID really did bring out a lot more, more impact than we even thought. And coming back to people wanting that question for meaning. And also, it also highlighted the gap between those with privilege and those who are marginalized. And there's like an increasing ask and need for cultures that move beyond just diverse in terms of numbers, to cultures that really look at being inclusive and creating spaces where people feel like they are themselves and they can still belong. Yeah, so I think back to, again, bringing people is flexibility, like we've said, and that, we can all just navigate and you having leaders who can really have that mindset of bringing people together and working with that common purpose. And then I think it's really, looking at what are the elements and what are the challenges around, looking for like early warnings of trouble ahead, like as people come together, what is important for us as we move back into their spaces, and looking at what people value, identifying these cultural gaps, and sort of prioritizing, a sequence of a change process and bringing people back together. And we've seen, so I think what specifically even not only in a workplace, but in a tertiary environment where COVID, and you think that because you're helping with providing devices and providing data is going to help people to learn, but actually, sometimes the spaces that they're in isn't conducive, and so they're far more removed. And it's the same in the workplace. And similarly, where you think that because, transport is something that now you don't need to worry about because you don't need to travel, in actual fact, transport in itself is something that's less accessible, with trains not working and other things. But actually people want to have a space where they can feel like they're coming back home, in a sense, where there's a community, a place that they can work and they can engage. So it's not only about this physical space, but it's around this like sort of connectedness of bringing people together and being part of this sort of family that you're used to, because most people have huge issues back at home. And it's obviously shaken things up, working in home with families and pressure of all the other realities that we've had to deal with. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
It does, Gia, and you raised such an important point around diversity, and Shamim had mentioned it earlier as well. And I see that also Luke has put something in the chat speaking around how do you shift from a remote culture from an in-office culture to a remote culture. And specifically around diversity, one of the things that research has found is that organizations had developed their cultural identities around an organizational identity, which with COVID, once it went remote, became much more dispersed. We realize that actually our employees, our colleagues are part of broader communities, and that those communities are very diverse and sometimes actually quite distant from each other. So Shamim, let me poke a bit on this point of diversity. You had mentioned earlier the importance of accommodating diversity, but what are some of the ways that we can actually do that? And what are some important friction points for us to already anticipate? As Gia mentioned, some early warning signals to know that your sort of diversity points are not meshing as well as they could. Speak to us a bit about diversity and the importance of managing that well as part of innovating organizational culture.
Jerry, do you mind if I kind of take a step back before I attempt to answer that question with a slightly different perspective?
Yes.
And I think a part of our conversation needs to focus on, so I'd like to offer a perspective that says, actually, you can't design organizational cultures. Organizational cultures are actually very complex, and they emerge over a long period of time through engagement, sociological, historical processes. That's not to say that you can't have organizational cultures, but it's a mix of design and emergence. And the design side is less in our controls than we think. The emergent processes is actually what drives organizational culture, in my view. So that says, well, what do you do then as a leader if you want to be able to develop, shift, influence, nudge organizational cultures? And that's where I think part of the diversity question comes in, is that the emergence is that you have people interacting who come with multiple perspectives, different histories, different ways in how they construct their identities, different talents. And it's those kind of interpenetration of those things that ultimately leads to the organizational culture. So I'm not answering your diversity question directly, but I'm trying to kind of reason that actually it is diversity that drives culture. Because if we were all the same, monolithic, homogeneous, there's not much to do with culture. Culture is this organic, dynamic process through all of these interactions. Okay, so let's take a step back. So what do you do? And to me, the trick and the answer, and it's not the full answer, but the answer is that leadership works at the boundaries. Leadership works on the boundaries. So the best we can do is kind of set the boundaries around what this organization is about, how it needs to shift, and so on. And part of that is, this is where we can bring in the foresight conversation. Part of leadership's role is to say, look, scan the world around me. What's going on? And how do the boundaries need to shift that we can start working on, and then accept that it's not in our control. We can nudge, we can shift, and let the diverse impacts and interactions kind of take us somewhere. And it's a constant motion, moving, dynamic, living kind of perspective.
Thanks, Shamim. Thank you for taking us back and for giving us that broader context around, again, emergence and dynamism, and how diversity is actually not only just a component, but also a driver of that emergent culture. I still want to push a little bit more on the challenges around diversity, because in as much as it's emergent and is a component for creating culture, it really is a friction point. It can be a friction point not only in terms of what Kerry mentioned, personality-wise, introvert, extrovert, but all those other aspects you talked about. We come from different backgrounds. Gia mentioned different socioeconomic backgrounds. Some of us are part of one side of the digital divide, and some of us are part of the other. So perhaps let me bring Colin in here. And ask Colin to share perhaps around any issues that you have come across in your work, especially around friction around change and culture, where we don't actually have this sort of unified purpose or journey that we're walking together that is actually got points of tension.
Yeah, thanks, Njeri. So I'm actually gonna go back slightly as well to the question you asked to Gia and incorporate the one you just asked, because I think that these things are interlocked. The question you asked, I think, was what's one of the biggest challenges to culture? And the challenge blatantly across the board, always in every single instance, is leadership. Okay, the way in which leaders approach this, the way in which they see the world, the things that they say, the ways in which they act, the bravery with which they are willing to approach life alters everything. We always say that, on balance and over time, you deserve the people you have. If you have people who are adaptable and confident and accountable and so on, take a bow, because you did that. That didn't happen without leadership. If you've got a bunch of people who, as soon as they're remote, they're not working anymore and you don't know where they are, that's on you, I'm afraid. And we saw that at the beginning of the pandemic, where organizations that did very well in terms of making the transition from office to remote typically did so because leadership already had a relationship with the people that enabled them to have the kind of conversations, truthful conversations that enabled them to say, is this working? What do we need to do? What do we need to change? What are you struggling with? Am I communicating too often, too infrequently? Other than that, organizations that didn't do that, that were always, that struggled with it, they were probably the ones that in the office didn't really have a very clear sort of communication or leadership style anyway. It was spotty. And so any organization had groups of happy people and groups of unhappy people. And that's just the reality of it. Now, on the matter of diversity, so if we steer strictly away from matters of race and gender and so on, and we think about just the socioeconomic diversity that exists in any workplace, every company has people who get up in the morning, have breakfast, get into their BMW and drive to work listening to classic FM, and people who get up at 4 a.m. and take 3 taxis. Everybody's got that. That's just one of the things that happens here. The question you have to ask yourself as in office space is, how much much of that is your problem? How much of it is when you come through the door, we have an expectation? Because you can't solve everybody's life problems. And partly the contract we have is that we've given you work and a salary, and we're going to try and make you comfortable here, but I'm not here to solve all of your life problems. But in a remote space, we're asking you to stay in the space where you are. And sometimes what people have got, the best thing they've got, is the fact that they get to leave, during the course of the day. So, those people who are able to set up lovely home offices in the remote space and have all their space, and their children were taken away by the 3 domestic helpers that they've got, that was fantastic. Some people live in a 1-bedroom apartment with 2 kids. It's not that easy. And so these are the things that I think we need to be mindful of. I would say going fully remote, you'd at least need to consider putting together some sort of a budget and some sort of a plan to create out-of-home office spaces where people could go to for a couple of hours a day or a couple of hours a week or something. If it's a matter of, right, everybody's working from home and we no longer have an office, I think that's an error, because we're failing to note the fact that some people simply can't work from home in the same way everybody can. And that's an aspect of diversity that is directly related to remote working that really needs to be borne in mind.
Thank you, Colin, for that. And I hear a lot. You're sort of poking on the issue of incentives, and there's a question from Lloyd there that I'll come to in just a moment. But Adjoa, I see you. Please go ahead.
No, Njeri, I'm actually just joining to prompt questions from the chat. So we have from Lloyd, and then we also have a question from Andre Farid, who's also popped in.
Thanks, Adjoa. So yes, around that question of incentives and holding leadership accountable that Colin just emphasized now, how do we actually ensure that our leaders are engaging intentionally from a meaningful vantage point with shaping their organizational culture? And let me jump in here and emphasize what Shamim had mentioned around that foresight perspective and thinking long-term and understanding that actually culture is dynamic and emergent and is not something that happens. Rome wasn't built in a day. Our organizations have got histories, they exist in a certain present, and of course we've got visions and missions, objectives that we're striving towards achieving. So from that perspective, how do we ensure that the incentives are properly aligned to the organizational culture we're hoping to shape? And thinking around shaping that culture, not only for the short term, but for the long term. So let me actually add to that question what Andre is asking around not only incentives from Lloyd, but how do you begin to take organizations through that journey of cultural change and innovation from point A to point B, and point B and C and D and maybe even Z if we're thinking in the long term. So let me pose that to each of you, Gia, Shamim, and Colin, as we begin to sort of wrap up the conversations amongst us and open it up a bit more to the floor and seeing if there's any questions from our participants online. So what are some of the ways we can ensure leadership is properly incentivized to build organizational culture, and how do we get organizations started on this journey of cultural innovation from point A to B and from point B to Z, or from the short to the long term? So Gia, let me open it up to you, and then I'll just go straight ahead to Shamim and Colin. Go ahead.
Thanks, Njeri. Yeah, so I think, going back, and some of us already done, is really starting with a clear purpose and vision, and that the culture is like consciously crafted so that what your organization is trying to achieve. And what's really important for me that I don't feel has been shared is co-creating that. So it's really that, the desired culture is everyone is involved in creating that together. So it's not just leadership and executives having these strategy decisions and then telling everyone else what needs to happen. It's that you bring people into these conversations, and the more, I've always said that the people who are part of creating it and thinking about it are the ones that are more committed to making sure that it happens. And also, it's not so about like the words. It's not about this is the strategy, this is the vision. It's around the way things are done. And people very quickly pick up on what's the incongruence around what is said and what you do in terms of rank and power. And that creates, it erodes trust and people become cynical. And so for me, obviously, culture is maintained through the one is obviously attraction and selection and attrition of your staff and who you bring in and how you support them, and the new employees and how you're on board. But then it's also around the leadership and how you reward in a way that's like trust and authenticity. And so you're really creating a sense of transparency that people feel this ownership mentality in the team. And something I really liked, which I saw on an organization that's online, is they say create a culture, they say, that's loosely coupled. So it means that you're trusting employees and empowering them to do stuff on their own without that sort of bureaucracy and fear of failure, but also that's highly aligned so that you're communicating your overall goals and the bigger picture without having to micromanage everyone, so that you can be confident that you're all working together to the same picture. And it's not to say that it's all flexible and all creative and all fun, because you're actually also then holding accountable and you have the numbers to measure that and to be precise. So I'll stop there and open to the rest.
Thank you, Gia. Shamim, please share some thoughts from yourself.
Okay, so Njeri, I think there's a small danger that we get caught up in a discussion like this where we are focusing on a small proportion of the organization. We're focusing on an organizational elite. Every organization has routine work, and that routine work can be drudge work, and quite often it's done by low-paid staff. Then we have the more kind of knowledge, high-level knowledge, conceptual work, and there's a danger that we kind of sweep under the carpet the fact that there is a lot of routine that's going to be automated in time, and organizations are going to change, and some of this will just have to carry on for the next 10, 15 years. And so I think if we're taking the long-term view, my sense is that a slightly different perspective from Colin, that we actually have to start expanding our boundaries of what our role in organizations are. So if we take the idea around community and culture, things like social, environmental, and gender justice becomes much more prominent. When that becomes prominent, that means we have to start rethinking how we treat people who are not part of this elite knowledge workers that we thrive on, we want the autonomy, etc. How do we kind of change that perspective a little? So that means an entire new way of the role of the corporation, the organization, the business in society in the longer term perspective. And I think we must just be careful we don't lose sight of that when we start doing the incentivizing. If we're shifting, for example, let's take this notion that we're shifting from an in-office environment to fully remote, inverted commas, okay? So we can do that when you're doing knowledge work. So there'll be a component of the organization that's producing widgets or whatever they might be doing. And if it's not entirely knowledge-based, you can't shift everything to remote, but you can still shift much of your work to remote because you've outsourced everything else to China or to Vietnam or whatever it might be. And we've got to watch that, especially in a country like South Africa. So that means that when we're saying we're shifting to online, there'll be elements that we can shift online and there'll be elements that we can't. And we have to reconceive what that means. Even when we're shifting fully online, we're actually releasing a lot of asset, okay? So how do we take that investment we're releasing? We might now shut down offices or rent or sell buildings that, huge buildings that have high asset value that we sell, that now becomes cash, okay? How do we take that cash and invest it in ways that are generative, but it's not just profit in the form of dividends, etc., to the shareholders? That cash has also got to be distributed in ways to build new kinds of social infrastructure, that we invest in social infrastructure so that our staff, our people can still be part of vibrant organizations that they feel they have a place in. Thank you.
Thank you, Shamim. Colin, some provocations there from Shamim on your leadership focus and asking to expand the boundaries, but what are your comments around incentivization and bringing organizations along this journey?
Yeah, listen, I mean, I agree with everything that's been said. I think, though, that I wholeheartedly agree with everything that's been said. I think my focus, though, is if we observe how poorly the switch to remote working went. And when I say poorly, I mean people did their jobs. Companies consistently tell me they had their best year ever in 2020. But that best year came at the hands and heads of people who put in 17-hour days. It's not sustainable. And I think the reason that happened is because leaders, managers, by and large, are not equipped to manage this way. I mean, and that doesn't mean they're bad at what they do. This is just a new game for them, and they haven't been trained in this methodology. And so no matter what, like, for example, being comfortable with outputs, not inputs, saying that I'm not going to see you every day anymore. I'm going to check in half an hour a week. On Friday, I need this from you, and just relying on people to get it done. Now, that requires sort of a level of trust, which I think is broadly been deliberately not baked into our systems. We create processes and policies to protect ourselves against the 3% of people who might mess us around and handcuff the 97% who'd never have done it even without the rule, right? And that's kind of how we do it. So we don't manage based on trust. We don't manage based on expectation of work. We manage based on push. Let me push you. And now I can't push you anymore. And that meant that there was too much management, either too much management overreach, or there was too much underreach and people wallowed. And so I think there's a whole bunch of retraining that has to happen. And to my mind, and especially, and never mind sort of, we're talking about operating models to an extent now, but we're veering into that anyway. But if I speak purely about culture, I genuinely believe any behavior change, any kind of understanding about psychology, any kind of understanding about how people work, that has to happen with the top 20 people in the organization before you can do it anywhere. Now, I'm not saying it doesn't need to happen elsewhere in the organization, but no kind of behavior change focus that happens at level 3 is going to have any impact if level 1 continues doing what they were doing. And so what I would like to suggest is that we flip the organization where previously, if you draw an org chart, you've got the CEO at the top and the exco below them, and then we get all the way down to the call center people at the bottom. But the reality is, though, those people at the very top need to consider themselves to be at the very bottom now. They are the foundations of a building. The building cannot stand without strong foundations. And the foundations, therefore, this can't be some ephemeral version of leadership at the top where they occasionally write strategy and occasionally stick to it. But it's going to have to be where everything that happens at the top informs the strategy. The top now being the call center and moving on down through middle management to the managers, to the senior leaders, etc. And the way we write strategy and the way we create culture and the way we lead these things is based on the feedback we get from inside the organization. Now that's very different. That hasn't happened before. And I think then we need to get used to the fact that those people, and I mentioned, each organization treating itself as a business school, we have to get much better at listening to what they've got to say and much better at allowing people to experiment, because this is all one giant experiment. As has been said, one can't simply put together a project plan for culture and say, these are the steps and this is what we will achieve at the end. Once you get going, you're making it up as you go along. But we need to create the situation, and managers and leaders need to be used to the situation that nobody ever gets fired or berated for doing something wrong for the right reasons. In other words, what we're trying to do, if we understand the goal, is we're trying to get to it and let people experiment to whatever extent you want them to do that. And then, at the end of the day, I think we also need to, especially if it's going to be in a remote sense, but actually in the renewed work sense, from the office sense as well. This is my final point. I mentioned meaning versus purpose earlier. I think everybody needs to understand why the work they do matters. They understand why this is a worthwhile trade-off for a day of my time. I'm coming here and I'm doing this, but I like the organization I work for. I like my colleagues. I like my managers. I like what we're doing. I like the reasons we're doing it. I think we're the right ones to do it. That's that. But we maybe need to step away from people purely getting meaning from the work that they do. Meaning must come from other things, right? The reason that I'm here, the complete human being I am, is going to be partly about my work, partly about other things. But somehow the vernacular, especially around culture, the language that we use has become all about people need to find meaning in their work. And I don't think they do. They need to think that what they do is worthwhile. They need to think that they make a contribution to it. And maybe that's as far as we need to take this. Bit controversial.
Thanks, Colin. Yes, but I am really enjoying the controversy of it. Actually, what I'm enjoying about this conversation is the fact that we are highlighting there are no easy answers. And from a futures perspective, that's a very good place to start from, especially in complex times and when dealing with complex situations like organizational culture. So no easy answers, but very much around ensuring our thinking is appropriately positioned for some of the ways in which we're framing the questions. And if I can just pick from the comments that you've all shared before taking it to some of the questions on the floor and also inviting yourselves to maybe interact, Shamim, Jia, Colin, amongst yourselves and see if you have any questions for each other. But from Jia, we got the importance of being loosely coupled and highly aligned. And I want to add to that the idea of being systemically aligned, because from both Shamim and Colin, underscoring what Gio was mentioning, it's very important to bring everyone along within the organization and expanding the boundaries of how we understand our roles within the organization. So some rethinking, some learning and some unlearning needing to go on there, so that we get and we develop entirely new ways of thinking about organizations, even flipping them, as Colin has suggested, so that we reassess where we feel the power or the influence or the sustaining forces of the organization lies. And then some more high level, maybe more amorphous points were raised as well. So it's important to build leadership capability, but that very much is around trust and authenticity, and leaders and all of ourselves understanding that self-leadership and masterful role as well, coming to the table in a way that brings the community together. So learning and unlearning in holistic ways. Let me take it to some questions in the chat, although I know that we've already situated our conversation this morning as not one that's answering questions per se, but perhaps just helping us reframe the ways in which we're thinking about these issues. So one important question, and I actually think they're linked, is how do you shift from a command, instruct, and control to a more inclusive and empowering organization without affecting business success? And I know that there are some models out there, like an ambidextrous model, the idea of keeping both engines of the organization running. There may be some thoughts from the panel on that. How do you actually shift an organization from command and control, and especially when command and control and the sort of leadership hero style that Elon Musk displays, hire and fire management style, how do you move from those popularized leadership and management cultures to something that's more emergent, inclusive, connected? How do you break some of these very set organizational, cultural standards and behaviors? Perhaps let me take it again. Let me do the round and start with Colin, and then we can go back to Gia and Shamim. Go ahead, Colin.
Thank you. You retrain managers to begin with. They need to learn how to manage differently. They need to learn what it is okay to be comfortable with. You need to sort of write the strategy around that, right? So we're going to be less controlling, less have a higher expectation of outputs. That means they need to be trained how to delegate better. They need to be trained how to create better briefs for people. They need to be trained how to check in. They need to become comfortable with that style of management. I think you will always have problem people, but you had problem people in the office anyway. But by and large, I think people tend to value their jobs. I think at least we need to start from that perspective, or else what are we doing? And I think people will do their jobs relatively well, and most of them will do them as well as they possibly can, as long as they know what they're doing, as long as they know what the expectation is. I think the challenge is we haven't really ever been versed in how to do that, and so we haven't done it. And it's nobody's fault. This has been new. This has been unexpected, thrown upon everybody, and we've all been trying to figure it out. But I think that, there is no doubt whatsoever, there are very, very, very successful models for remote working, very successful models for remote management, very successful case studies, companies you can study that have done it. And they haven't used magic and they haven't used wizardry. They've just had managers who are able to lead that way. And so that would be my jumping off point.
Thanks, Colin. Shamim, this is very much your playing ground, developing leadership capability. What can you share with us from your experience and expertise?
So yeah, Njeri, I think it's almost in a sense, the question goes to the heart of leadership development itself. So it's working with the organizational leaders in terms of understanding who they are, their role in organizations, how they interact with each other, the impacts that they have. So this goes to the heart of the whole focus on leadership development and exploring that terrain, which is fairly broad. So at the first level is to understand that firstly, command and control is not the only way. Secondly, there are many other more effective ways of doing leadership in terms of influence, in terms of engagement, in terms of collaboration, to show the outcomes. The third one was something I alluded to earlier. You could actually design and run simulations that kind of show these different perspectives and the impacts that they have. And then finally, I just want to make it, there are some really powerful conceptual models which translate to methodologies out there. And one of them that comes to mind around this particular question is the viable system model, which essentially shows and in a sense, we might have heard, about 20, 30 years ago, Charles Handy spoke about the principle of subsidiarity. And the viable system model essentially, in one essence, I mean, it's much more sophisticated than that, but it captures this idea that you delegate authority down as far as possible into the organization where it sits. So you have very clear, and this is not it's not an organizational hierarchy, it's a logical hierarchy. There are 5 subsystems, and each of those systems, it's actually based on the viability of the human body, by the way. It was developed by Stafford Beer. It's more than 35 years of study, research, application across organizations across the world. But the short answer about that is it shows the relationships between different levels of the organization and subsystems within an organization about why command and control is actually not such a great idea in terms of how you devolve subsidiarity, autonomy to where it needs to be, but there are channels of information flows that ensures accountability. So you're using an organizational architecture combined with information flows that helps create a viable organization without this kind of command and control and the micromanagement we see all the time. And there's a common, I'll stop after this, they call it the S5 to the S3 collapse. Essentially S5, the management that's supposed to be looking after the kind of bigger perspective, the long-term future viability of the organization, move into the engine room when they shouldn't. And that's the classic micromanagement kind of perspective. So there are, and I mean, that's not the only one. There are other ways of doing it as well.
Thanks, Shamim. Thank you so much for that comprehensive response and speaking a bit around some of the challenges to avoid. Gio, what would you respond? Recalling also that you already shared about the importance of storytelling and having the right heroes on your platforms to showcase. But please respond to some of the queries raised here.
Yeah, I really like, what Colin was saying, and we look at it like when you turn Maslow over on its head. And like you say, looking at, what are the basic needs and as who am I, and then looking outwards and listening to your employees. And like you say, creating role models and also possibly mentors. And with learning being a key part of building an organization, but learning with a clear path to even succession and creating goals that people know that they're moving towards something. So for me, it's really about being devoted to the people that you're engaged with, and it's about transformation around integrity, and bringing in human collaboration. So for me, it's really, regular engagement. A lot of the things that we've already said, validating what's good, creating real milestones for people to work towards. And I think what's important is just radiating positivity. It's around living your purpose and the value of your organization and showing that and role modeling that too. So that it is an inspiring workplace, and it's a place where people feel comfortable to come to. And it really is that. It's that environment of learning, whether it's online or that culture of working together or in person. And finding ways to connect, whether it's online, whether it's creating lunch or providing employees, food every day, or spaces to play, wherever it is to connect, which is really important.
Thank you, Jia. And I think you've responded quite substantially to a query that was posted by Derek there in the chat as well, around the importance of engaging meaningfully with our colleagues so that actually their whole lives, including their socioeconomic background, but the full cornucopia of their diverse identities is something that we interact with and recognize and are also aligned with in terms of a community within the organizational space. So we have a few minutes left now, and I want to allow you all to just have a few wrap-up thoughts. And if I could just give you some signposts to your wrap-up thoughts. We've talked quite a bit around the importance of innovating organizational culture, some of the ways we can do this, the importance of being open and flexible and understanding it's an emergent and dynamic process, and the role of the individual to the collective and how we can engage all levels of the organization. So as we close up our conversation, very interesting conversation this morning, and I've learned so much. What would you say is maybe 2 or 3 key important points to keep in mind as organizations think around engaging with their organizational culture. And it can be anything from the broad scope of the organization. Remember, we're not trying to provide answers, but really broaden our thinking and position us more comfortably to engage with this dynamic and emergent process. So as we wrap up, Gia, Shamim, Colin, what would you say are some 2 or 3 key takeaways that you would like to leave our participants online with this morning?
For me, it's bringing up again that strong sense of purpose and values, creating a space where people can learn and even innovate. So for people who are entrepreneurial, allowing people to think and of new ideas, whether it's in the company's product development or even for themselves, where they can think and create and innovate, and providing that sense of community and belonging in a way that they feel heard and connected.
I think for us, it's very much a matter of, people have a perspective. Sorry, I'm about to be visited by my daughter now, just at the very end. So, we might have 2 on the camera in a moment.
We welcome your whole life, Colin, as part of our conversation. Okay. Your daughter's very welcome.
You keep disappearing, baby. Look, I think very simply, we all have an expectation for, and every one of us has built a life of our own, which is built to our dimensions, the people we hang around with, where we live, what we do, what we're interested in, and we're all terribly engaged in our own lives. But then we come to work and put on a work hat, because in those instances, when we get to work, somebody else is telling us what to do, what to think, what to believe, where to be, etc., etc. And I think the key here, and there is a very fun and interesting structure for this, but very simply, the goal is to make work feel more like life, so that when I, a complete human being who has trust in my life, trust in my relationships outside of work, whose opinion is valued, because that's just how it is when you're an adult and you've got friends and family, and all of these sorts of things. Somebody who's got a bit of status, maybe as a homeowner, all of those sorts of things are the way in which I perceive myself at a personal level. When I come to work, how do I find a way that creates the workspace feel more like that than, sort of a place where I have to be differently, I'm treated differently, I'm looked at differently. So look, I think just on the point Shamim is making about command and control and the challenges with that, command and control is fine if, as a manager, you want to be responsible for all the outcomes and have full accountability for everything. But that's not how it is in life. That's never how it is. We share things, we share ideas, we share all of that. The model for how to create a set of work relationships, in terms of the culture of the organization, already exists. We're just looking in all the wrong places. What do you think of that? Was that good? Yeah. Okay.
Shamim, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, I think for me, perhaps the 3 kind of takeouts I'd like us to maybe pay some attention to is the idea of the full human being and autonomy, meaning the full human being. So giving people the space for more autonomy and trusting that people will bring their best in the setup we're giving them. The second one is this idea that if we want to change an organization, this is not new, but I think it's very powerful, is that you change organizations by the way we change our talk. We change our conversations, we change the organization. So we need to be creating spaces, dialogic spaces, for people to be able to have the kinds of conversations that are needed to be able to give that kind of perspective around organizational culture and so on. Yeah, I think I'd leave it there. Thank you.
What a perfect way to wrap up our conversation this morning, Shamim, to emphasize the importance of conversations like this and platforms like this, so that we can bring together experts and experience shared by yourself. Gia, Colin, thank you so much for your time and for sharing some of your thoughts just in an open and comfortable way for us to reflect on, and giving us some takeaways as well. And hopefully what we'll do in our organizational spaces, and with thanks also to the Business School Executive Development for empowering these conversations in our business community, is to continue to build these spaces so that we reframe the questions and collectively work towards solutions that meet our highest ideals, right? And fulfill our purpose and bring that meaning and connection that we've all been speaking about this morning. So with those few comments and wrapping up on that very, I think, open and positive note, let me hand it over to our colleagues to close the event for the day. Thank you, Adjoa and Kerry.
Thanks so much, Njeri, and thanks so much to our panel. I think Tuli put it perfectly, or Tulani, sorry, apologies, put it perfectly when he said, or she said, very empowering session. I think that this has given us a lot of food for thought. And even if people take home one or two things and they start implementing those within, one, from a leadership perspective, and two, as an employee and how you engage with your teams as well, it's been super empowering. So thank you. With that, we wrap up the session, and we hope that you enjoyed your pre-long weekend event and that you can now go into the sunset of the long weekend with some food for thought. And just to say a few words about our upcoming events, our next event will be on the 23rd of June, and we've very cryptically named it All Roads Lead to Data. So we'll be looking at some of the upcoming technologies, some of the trending technologies that we're seeing on the horizon, and how companies can actually make sense of those technologies in terms of interpreting the data that they get as a result of interacting with those. And that will be a discussion led by Prof. Martin Butler. So with that, thanks so much. Have a wonderful Thursday, long weekend, and we'll see you in June.